Good evening.
Good evening.
Welcome. Thank you all for coming. Tonight we have some people from the early 50s of the Maine here to talk about their life stories. And they're going to be sharing interesting facts with us tonight. So please welcome them and enjoy.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Mrs. Timothy Foster. I'm widow of Captain Timothy Foster. Our family was the first family to settle here in Pontown. Now, there was before us, there was a man named Scott, Samuel Scott. He built a hut near the edge of the Great Pond. And some people even called this place Scottstown after him. But Mr. Foster bought the cabin and the contents from him on a handshake. Well, that Scott must not have passed on the money to the proprietors because they tried to have it again from Mr. Foster. And then that man brought a case against Mr. Foster at the court down in Pownellborough. Claimed theft because Mr. Foster took the hay from the meadow and the provisions from the cabin. Since two of the men deciding the case were from Pownellborough, like Scott, it was no surprise that the decision went against Mr. Foster in favor of Scott. Some say that Mr. Foster was jailed, but you will find no record of that. Later, we had of Scott a deed for the land, which cost 26 pounds. Our lot was number 8, 200 acres and 1 mile long. Mr. Foster had preceded us up here, and we all came in 65. Our eldest, Timothy Jr., was about 19. And then there was Billy, Eliphalet, Susanna, David, Thomas, Stuart, John, our dear Oliver, who died early, and my little namesake Sibler, who was then 2 years old. And then our Stephen was born the next year. He was the first English child to be born here in Pontown Plantation, because that was the name of this place. When the petition was sent to the general court down in Massachusetts asking to become a town, the request was granted, but the name was changed to Winthrop. The change had not been requested, so that was a surprise. It was not a surprise that Mr. Foster was named one of the very first selectmen, along with Mr. John Chandler, Mr. Jonathan Whiting, and others. It was difficult to live here. People survived on game and fish and what wild fruit they could gather and a few crops, and most worked in the woods cutting trees for lumber. We were blessed to have our boys. There were few roads, there was little industry. Most everyone had an orchard growing apples for drink and for eating. Early on, there was a grist mill on Cobbessy Stream, owned by Dr. Gardner. One time when the men had too much work to do to go to the mill, one of the boys rowed me across the Great Pond, and then I walked the 6 miles on the spotted tree trail to the mill. Spotted trees were little pieces cut out of the trees so we could follow. It was a long walk. I was heavily laden, and it took so long that it was dark when I came back. It was so dark, I couldn't find the horn. We used the horn to signal when it was time for somebody to come back and fetch us. So I had to spend the night alone in the woods. I must mention the War of the Revolution. When we received the news of the events in Lexington and Concord, straight away 19 Winthrop men went off to Cambridge, including my Billy, Eliphalet, and David. Stuart also went to fight in 75. Mr. Foster was made a captain in the Lincoln County militia. Timothy Jr. was part of that dreadful expedition to Castine, but all 8 of our surviving sons fought. We lost 4 of them. John and Thomas, Billy and Eliphalet, they went off on ships to become privateers, and they never returned to us. But even our youngest Stephen enlisted as a private in Captain Foster's company when he was just 13. Mr. Foster died in the spring of 1785. He was cutting a tree and a large branch fell on him and fractured his skull. Our son Stuart went down to Brunswick on snowshoes. Daniel Allen and Joseph Rice went with him. They returned with no doctor, just a tool to lift the skull. But Mr. Foster had already passed, which may have been a blessing. He was laid to rest in the burying ground near Deacon Metcalf's. My sons built me a new house after that. Mr. Foster had built the first frame building in Pondtown, and then that became part of a larger house. I'm almost 90 now, and my 4 surviving sons and 2 daughters have given me 48 grandchildren. Now, Timothy works as a tanner. David is an excellent farmer and one of the founders of the Winthrop Agricultural Society. And my little Stephen is well known as a hunter, except now they call him Old Hunter Foster. Thank you.
Hi, I am Captain William Stevens. I was born July 4th, 1760. Today, July 4th is a big deal, fireworks, barbecues, and everything. But way back then, it was just another ordinary day. There was no United States. There was no freedom. We were still a part of England. I was child number 10 of 11. The whole Stevens family owe us all being here to my 4th great-grandfather, Henry Stevens. He was born in London around 1611. He and my 4th great-grandmother, Alice, sailed for the new land shortly after they were married in 1635. He was 24 years old. Oddly enough, they came across on 2 separate ships. He came across on the Defense and she came across on the Abigail. The reasons why are lost to history. Between the years of 1635 and 1640, they lived in Lynn, Massachusetts, where he worked as a servant to a Mr. John Humphrey. Now, just because he was a servant doesn't mean he was poor or of low standing. It was very common during the time of the Great Puritan Migration to have servants of substantial status and wealth back in England come here and sign on as servants. It was a way for them to have a roof over their heads. It was a way for them to get a meal, to save some money, more money, and get the lay of the land, so to speak, in this new country before they went out on their own. Apparently, Mr. Humphrey's dealings with his servants weren't so great, because in late November of 1640, my 4th great-grandfather Henry and his fellow servants fired up, aka torched, Humphrey's barn and consumed all his corn. On December 1st, 1640, Henry was ordered by then Governor John Winthrop to be a servant for 21 more years for setting fire to his master's barn. Now, fortunately for Henry and the rest of the servants, within less than a year, John Humphrey had it with this new land. He is like, forget it. He threw in the towel. I am out of here. And he sailed home to England, never to return. And in doing so, Humphrey's servants were all set free. So Henry, he took that little window of time and it's like, I'm out of here, and hightails it to Boston with his entire family. On July 26, 1641, he was granted a great lot. And in November of 1644, he was granted several acres of land in what was called Muddy River. There, the family and the generation grew and prospered, the children marrying and moving off to various parts of Massachusetts and New Hampshire. My father, Joseph Stevens, Jr., and my mother, Elizabeth, are the ones who moved to and settled this family to Ipswich, New Hampshire. Now, Ipswich plays an important part in Winthrop because that's where most of the founding families of Winthrop came from. So Stevens was a neighbor, a friend, a fellow farmer. the Stevens family were carpenters and masons and farmers. So they all got to know each other. The Whitings, the Forsters, the Chandlers. So in the Chandlers, they decided they were going to follow the Forsters, and they're going to come up here and find out what this pond town is all about. He was the fourth family to settle here. Now, there was a lot of land to be had and work, so he brought along my older brother, Amos. He's number 4 of 11. Amos was 18, and the year was 1767. He came on as a hired hand and helped build Chandler's Mill in 1768. And he worked for Chandler at milling 2 to 3 years for $5 a month. During that time, he sent word to my father, Joseph, that life was pretty good up here. Why don't you pack up the family and come on up? So my father did. And we moved to Pond Town in 1769. I was 9 years old. Now, back then, us still being a part of England, we were under the rule of the king. He had an agreement with us colonists that if we would stake out land, you have 3 years to clear that land, build something upon it, and make it profitable. And if you do that within 3 years, then the king or the Kennebec proprietors on behalf of the king would grant you that land. And that's what my father did. On August 12, 1772, Joseph Stevens Jr. was deeded 200 acres, the land upon which my house still stands, along with all the stone wall remnants throughout Sherwood Forest and the whole surrounding area. My father went on to become an active member of the town. He and Jonathan Whiting and Jonathan Chandler were the committee that was formed to effect the finishing of the meeting house, which was approved at a town meeting on July 28th of 1774. During the war, my father was also a member of the Committee of Correspondence, Inspection, and Safety. As for Amos, after working for Chandler, he took up a lot of land on the north side of Winthrop Pond. He camped there for several years alone, and in 1773, he bought some lumber from Chandler, floated it up the pond, and built a small house halfway between the pond and the road. Road is still there. And the Maine Central Railroad ran across that farm a mile or so up north of the village. Went on to become Norcross House. During his long and productive life, Amos was a selectman, a constable, and at some point a tax collector of the town. He married Mary Whiting, daughter of John Whiting, very late in life, and then they moved to Strong, Massachusetts, where he died February 4th of 1832. As for me, I grew up here in Winthrop, helping my dad with the farm and working as a carpenter in town, along with Amos and my youngest brother, Jonas, 11 of 11. When I turned 18, I joined Colonel Lamb's 2nd Regiment Artillery Division in the Continental Army, along with a lot of the young men of this town. I served in the Army fighting for independence up until December 31st, 1780. I had risen to the rank of captain. Having survived the war, I came home to Winthrop and married Susanna Whiting, daughter of Jonathan, and sister to my brother Amos's wife, Mary. My wife was a twin. Joanna was her name, but 2 brothers marrying 2 sisters, that was enough for the Stevens family intermingling on that front. And upon my return, I became an active member of the town and was helping my dad. On December 28, 1789, 9 years after my return from the Army, my father deeded me a portion of the land and the house with the understanding that he was responsible for everything until his death. He also deeded land to my brother Jonas. My father died right here in Winthrop, October 4th, 1791, and he's buried right there in the cemetery, the big, huge stone. That's that's where we are, and throughout the whole cemetery, wherever you see Stevens, you see Foster, they're always right there together. My brother Ephraim, 9 of 11, married Anna Foster. We just heard from her mom. Several of our family, Stevens, branched off and settled in Ohio, where many still live. And I've actually been in touch with some of them. They're still there, out there being prosperous. One's a doctor, they're all great out there. Susanna and I went on to have 10 children of our own, raising them here in this house, the house where this person pretending to be me still lives. One of my sons built and lived in the house across from mine. I can see it from my parlor window. It still stands. One of my daughters married Sears. Her house still stands too on the corner of 133 and 41. My Susanna, a wonderful, good, hardworking wife and mom, died August 27, 1822. And just over a year from her death, I had a heart attack while out in my fields working the land that I loved. The Stevens family, at one point, one of them was still Stevens owned in the house that I live in up until 1942. It was still owned by a Stevens. So from 1769 until 1942, Stevens lived in that house. My husband and I are actually only the 4th people to ever own and live in that house since 1769. And the different owners of the house respected it and they kept it. They didn't try and they didn't ruin it. And I mean, it is really still pretty old and wonderful. So that's me.
Nobody's clapping.
Good evening, I'm Stephen Pullen.
You're not bad.
As Stephen Pullen, I was born September 30th, 1744 in Attleboro, Massachusetts. My parents were James Pullen Sr. and Lydia Wood Pullen. I had 8 siblings. I was drawn to this Metcalf area by a meadow area that also had a brook in 1765. It was lot 56, and it was granted to me on December 14th, 1768, and encompassed 160 rods wide and a mile long. And if any of you are real mathematicians, I'd love to know what that is. Stephen married Mary Mercy Blackington around 1768. They had 13 children, 6 sons and 7 daughters. I built a log cabin, and at one point while I was away working, the cabin caught fire and burned. Apparently, I had stored gunpowder in the cabin, and the blast was so loud that I heard it from afar and had to come home quickly. I served with the civil service during the American Revolution. In the Penobscot expedition of 1779 records document I was a soldier in the failed expedition to Penobscot under the command of Solomon Lovell, Paul Revere, and Dudley Stalton Stall to dislodge the British from Castine. I served as the very first constable in the township. I was a town treasurer in 1785 here in Winthrop. My name is on a petition from the town of Winthrop, dated 10 March 1771, as one of the 3 town selectmen. It is also said that a friend of mine came from Boston to visit and had apples in his pocket, and that I saved the seeds to be planted in Winthrop, and that the Winthrop green wealthy apple is supposed to be a descendant of those apples that I planted. My cider mill, along with others in Winthrop, were located in the eastern and central parts of town and were used for grinding the apples and extracting the apple juice. After Mary Marcy passed away on 18 January 1802, I remarried Elizabeth Giles in Attleboro, Massachusetts. Elizabeth passed away 8 February 1813. Both of my wives are buried in the Metcalf Cemetery. I passed away in 1815 at 70 years old, and I am also buried in the Metcalf Cemetery with my 2 wives. Around 1817, the homestead was sold to John Williams. The information you have to remember of this time is often incomplete and sketchy, unfortunately. And I'm lucky enough tonight to have a descendant here.
Awesome.
Yes, and she has a great picture of your great-great-grandfather,
Who is also named Stephen.
who was also named Stephen. And how many, between this Stephen and your great-great, how many generations?
Is his nephew.
It's his nephew. Okay. All right. So that was a fun thing to have happen tonight. So thank you.
Greetings, friends. My name is Gideon Lambert. So good to have you here this afternoon. I just left my blacksmith shop after putting another horseshoe on old Nellie and rode here as fast as Nellie could trot to talk to all of you. I left my comfortable life in Tisbury, Massachusetts, Martha's Vineyard. Last year in 1770, at the age of 42, on a sunny day in July, with my 4 children, my wife Susanna, and we settled on lot 71. 3 more children came later. We were a little less than all you guys. Lot 71 was assigned to my good friend and neighbor Ichabod. How? By the just reading this, by the Kennebec Properties on behalf of the King of England. But Ichabod conveyed it to me and moved to a lot next door. We built our house right away after spending the night in an abandoned camp, and it still stands in your time across from Ted's trackside. I can't believe that house is still standing. It's been a long, hard winter up here in Pond Town. We planted crops last summer and subsisted on milk and herbs until harvest. Yes, we had a cow, and fortunately maple syrup to sweeten the milk. We fell 4 or more acres of trees to burn come spring to have more room for gardening. I helped Ichabod bring in his moose he had shot away in the snowy woods, and we had venison to eat all winter. In the spring of 1771, Ichabod, Jonathan Whiting, and I signed an act of incorporation, and Pond Town became an official town named Winthrop after one of the proprietors. Folks didn't take too well to that, but the King's men in Massachusetts were in charge, so Winthrop, Pond Town became. Between you and me, I prefer Winthrop. Besides working in my blacksmith, making items like this with all the tools I made, I have spent a great deal of time around town improving the roads. Now that was hard work. But in 1776, the colonies declared independence from England, and all work in Winthrop for me ceased. I joined the revolution to fight beside my comrades and my son, Ebenezer, who was 15 at the time. After the war in 1783, I journeyed back to Winthrop and found my house in good order, as my sons Paul and Silas were 14 and 12 when I left for the war. Little Gideon was born in June, while Ebenezer and I were gone. He is mine. He was named after me. And Susanna took care of them, and Beulah 8 and Susanna 6, with the help of the other women in town. I was grateful for that care. We carried on best as we could, raising our children and making sure they were fed, clothed, and sheltered, and did what we could for the community. Down the road over at Squire Bishop's up on the county road was a fine distinct distraction from the gloomy, muddy springtime. In 1802, my good wife died. My son Paul built a house across the road, so I was not alone, living another 17 years in the house we shared for 32 years and left this earth on December 15th, 1819, at the age of 91.
And we don't know where he is.
I'm gonna stay fitting for mine. Good evening, my name is Hannah Adams Cobb Howard. I was born at the top of the hill on the old Lewiston Road in October of 1807. When I was 21 years old, in 1828, I married a fine man down the street by the name of Oakes Howard. We were married for 21 years until my passing in 1849. However, my husband had many more years to live and impact the town of Winthrop. Together, we had 6 children, 4 boys and 2 girls. And my whole life, I lived on the Old Lewiston Road in Winthrop, Maine. But let me tell you a little bit about my husband and his family. I'll start with my father-in-law, Nathan Howard III. He was born in 1772 in Bridgewater, Massachusetts. He married Lydia Copeland, born in 1780, who was from West Bridgewater, Massachusetts. And the 2 of them were married in Bridgewater in 1799. They had 2 kids, Silenus and James Copeland. The first child would pass away here in Winthrop when he was 12. At some point, with 2 small children, Nathan and Lydia decided to come to Winthrop, and they traveled by boat to Hallowell and made their way to Winthrop from there. They came to this area because they had relatives by the last name of Morse. In July 1802, Nathan purchased 200 acres on lot number 81 in Winthrop, in the Winthrop countryside for $1,000. Because you see, back then, Old Lewiston Road was very far from the center of town. After purchasing the land, Nathan's trade was carpentry and painting, and he felled the trees on the lot, and he built the house for his family using logs and timber from that property at what is now 514 Old Lewiston Road. It looks like this if you're driving on the road. So, during that time, there was a small carriage road that passed along the front side of the house, which now is the side of the house, because Old Lewiston Road, as we know it, wasn't technically there at that time. After the house was built, Nathan began farming the land. Nathan and Lydia welcomed 7 additional children to their family. My husband, Oakes, was the first born here in Winthrop. He was born in December of 1803, and some things say he was born on December 31st. Some things say he was born on December 21st. It's hard to know. That's how, as my fine friend here was saying, that sometimes things weren't cataloged accurately. There were a total of 6 brothers and 3 sisters in all. One of their sons, Nathan IV, who was born here in Winthrop, when he turned 25, moved to Mississippi, and he married a woman from South Carolina, and eventually owned a plantation with as many as 40 slaves, which is hard to even conceive because Maine was such an abolitionist state. But hopefully he was one of those owners that treated their help well. One of the daughters, Rachel, married my brother, Luther, from the Cobb farm. Another son, John Reed, moved to Massachusetts and eventually Colorado. And the youngest daughter, Lydia, moved to New Jersey when she got married. Everybody else remained in Winthrop. Nathan and Lydia Howard were some of the founding families, early members of the Universalist Church here in Winthrop, along with my father, Nathan Fisher Cobb, and my mother, Martha, but known as Patty Stanley. In 1818, Nathan was also one of the founding members of what they called the Agricultural Society. That later became the Kennebec County Agricultural Society. And while Nathan was one of the founding members, Oakes was later president of this organization for many years. For a short time in the late 1830s to the early 40s, Nathan Howard and Isaac Bonney purchased the sawmill downtown from Mr. Benjamin Dearborn. They later resold it in 1846 to an individual by the name of Luther Waltham. Linda and Nathan stayed in their home on Old Lewiston Road. Lydia and Nathan, yeah, on Old Lewiston Road, and Lydia outlived Nathan. She passed away in 1867, which was 9 years after Nathan had passed away. Now I'd like to move on to my husband, Oaks. My husband was a very busy man and involved in many things in his lifetime. Many of those things happened after my passing. However, when he was 15 and I lived up the road, Oaks was so involved in the family farm, and he had many ideas and was very visionary and took over management of the family farm at that time. He eventually rose to the rank of an honored agriculturist in this town, but was also sought after from people outside of Winthrop for his knowledge. During his time, he held several positions in local town government, including many years as a selectman. He was a justice of the peace for 19 years, I believe, and he served in the legislature in Augusta as well. In fact, these books right here, I brought today because they were left behind in the Cobb farm up on Old Lewiston Road, but these were these are both books of statutes for the law, because we didn't have computers back then. So they needed to know a law and they needed to look it up. They could do so in one of these books. Anybody who served in the legislature and needed the law. And I know that this was Oak's book because it has his name in it. So this set is from 1857. And it's funny because you can look up different things and they'd have stuff about coal and mineral ownership and different partnerships, and it's just actually quite amazing to look at and to see. And this is a real legislative desk that had been donated to our society here. Okay. Sorry, I lost my place by picking up the books. Okay. Oaks was an excellent farmer, and it earned him the nickname of Uncle Oaks from many people for his knowledge, and since he had been running a very successful farm since he was 15. He was also, in addition to just being a farmer or raising cattle, he was a well-respected orchardist. In his notes, at one point, in studying many varieties, he just determined that the Baldwin apple and the Roxbury russet were best because they kept longer and sold better in the community than those of other common varieties at this time. And they didn't just sell the apples to surrounding areas. Farmers that raised a lot of crops and apples and had cream and butter sent it to Boston. And that's why this whole area was more affluent for their farmers, because they weren't just depending on the local clientele. Because of the railroad, which is part of the reason why the railroad came to Winthrop, they were able to load their goods and services and send it down to Boston, where they could get paid a lot more money than they would have if it was just to the local people. He also was a future thinker in farming. He thought it was important back then to save seeds for future use, that we needed to instill protective timber practices. He thought at one point in his life that sheep were easier and cheaper to raise than beef cattle at one point. Additionally, he thought it was important to feed the animals with things just besides hay. He said that it was important to grow tuber plants such as potatoes, turnips, and radishes, because that would help make their cattle or sheep or whatever they were growing healthier, and it would also cost less and create less work for the farmer to take care of their cattle. Oaks was involved in the Winthrop Dairy Association, the Maine State Jersey Cattle Association, and then later the West Winthrop Farmers and Mechanics Club that would later become known as Winthrop Grange number 209. Their building meaning the Grange, was built on the old Lewiston Road in 1895, and it still exists today. Lastly, because he was so well respected for his ideas and research, Oakes and many of his papers are currently held at the Monmouth Museum archives, and articles have been written about them throughout time. After my death in 1849, Oakes went on and remarried Betsy Tinkham in 1851, and they remained together until he died in his hometown of Winthrop in July of 1897. Yes, I said 1897, and he was born in 1803. So he lived a very long life to the age of 94. And Oakes and many of his family members, as well as many of my family members, are buried in the Glenside Cemetery. Thank you.
I'm here tonight to speak to you about the educational system or that lack thereof in our early days after incorporation. As you all have heard, we were incorporated in 1771 as a town by the Court of Massachusetts. And following those, that was several years before the Revolutionary War, and the United States became a separate country, and it was 49 years before Maine was to become a separate state from Massachusetts. During those early years, things were very tough for the settlers, very hard life, and scarce commodities available. So the idea of education for children, although it was there, and at each year at the town meeting, it would usually be raised, there was no money appropriated for funding of education for a number of years. Other things had to take priority. When they did start having classes, it was usually some of our esteemed leaders in the community holding classes in their homes or their porches or barns. Certainly was not no modern conveniences in those locations. And there was no schoolhouses originally. That came later. But eventually did come to a time when the town did appropriate 20 pounds towards the education of the children in the town. And but it was divided by 6 different school districts that existed then. And at that time, Reedfield was still part of of Winthrop. So it was a big area it was covering, and 20 pounds didn't go very far among 6 different districts. For examples of how the leaders would help teach, the Dr. Moses Wing taught at Mr. Squire Bishop's house for 1 year, and another teacher was Benjamin Brainerd, who taught on the porch of Benjamin Fairbanks. Mr. Fairbanks followed him the next year and taught himself in his home. But that's the way it was. School books were very scarce. Paper was almost non-existent. And so usually the teachers would teach from the Bible. That was the most common book that they would have. And they only taught reading and writing. When the town did appropriate that, I think it was 1782, that 20 pounds, the subsequent years they gradually increased the amount. as they could. In 1789, Massachusetts passed a law that required several things. It increased the number of subjects that was taught. It now required the English language to be taught, the arithmetic, spelling, and decent behavior. Discipline was a very big thing in the schools then. And the kind of concept was that they didn't separate church and state too much back then, officially anyway, that mostly the townspeople wanted the children taught to be able to progress in life well, but also so that Satan was not allowed to advance his desires in ignorant people. So that was a major concern. So we wanted to keep Satan out. So discipline was very important. After that law in 1789 by Massachusetts also allowed for the qualifications of women to teach, which was a big major thing, and it required compulsory support for a primary school, required primary schools and compulsory support from the towns for those. The terms of the schools, when they started having the more formal schools, were usually a summer and a winter term. Women usually taught the summer ones, the men taught the winter ones. The terms ranged from 30 to 60 months, days in length, but they were not consistent from one district to the other. So some children got a lot of time, others got much less. Eventually the Massachusetts also required schoolhouses be built. In fact, I think the same year Winthrop started appropriating, they appropriated 160 pounds towards building some school buildings in some districts, but again, was not consistent throughout all the districts. And then the following year, they appropriated a larger amount to finish them because they weren't able to get them finished in that first year. As I said earlier, the men usually taught in the winter, women in the summer, but there was the discrepancy between wages among the genders was much like it is now. For a month's teaching, the men would get between $16 and $17. For women were paid weekly for some reason, but when you calculate the weekly amount for a month, it usually is between $6 and $8 instead of $16 to $17. Some things haven't changed too much, unfortunately. Like I said, we gradually improved and continued, supporting between requirements from Massachusetts before we became our own state, and then our own desires as we move forward in developing our settlements, that we did increasingly support our schools. And it's nowadays they are very, very important to the communities. The early schoolhouses were not insulated. If they had a fireplace or a wood stove, which is a little later, the stoves came later, you know, they were very lucky, and they had no indoor plumbing, anything like that. And like I said, the supplies were almost non-existent for the students. Then I don't think I would have liked to try to been teacher then. Although now today has its own challenges. But it was important to our early settlers. They did, and they gradually, as soon as they could, improved the educational system, and did make it a system eventually. So if there's any questions, I think I'm last and I'm glad to answer.
Yeah, the children have to pay to go to the school?
No, the parent, there were, when the town began to support, you know, with some allocation for the schooling, they also had a tax that the town would, that parents could subscribe to. It was usually like 40 cents a pupil, I believe. But it was not required of all the parents. The children could still go to school, even if the parents did not pay the tax. This was, so that was a good thing, that they did not discriminate and say, because you're too poor, you know, you can't go. So that was an additional supply of income for the schools, besides whatever the town itself had appropriated. And that's my understanding, that it was in addition. It's a little unclear, it could have been. Those taxes were used as part of the appropriation that the town allocated. I'm not sure. Again, some of our records are a little unclear, but that's, we've come a long ways from then. Oh, I did forget to tell you one of the two things I wanted to mention. Squire Bishop's house, that was not his title, Squire. That was his first name. So sometimes you'll see it Mr. Squire Bishop, which is the appropriate way, because that Squire was not a title. And then when Benjamin Brainerd taught on the porch of Benjamin Fairbanks's house that I mentioned earlier, there was 12 students. So quite a large one, you know, but that was before they had regular, you know, classes and schoolhouses in all the districts. So and Mr. Blaine, excuse me, Benjamin Brainerd had also taught the previous year in John Chandler's house. So that was how they just used whatever they had and made do. So okay. Thank you very much for.
It's the end of our presentation tonight. I hope you all enjoyed it. You're welcome to browse around if you like before you leave, or mingle amongst yourselves and talk about whatever you'd like to talk about. Thank you all for coming. Yeah.
Before we all dismiss, I just wanted to mention a few things that were coming up for at the History Center over the next month and a half. On April 29th, there's going to be, if you have any grandkids and things like that, Karen Toothaker is going to be doing a program on her new Say Cheese book. So that's happening here on the 26th, I believe, right? Or is it the 29th? Either the 26th or 29th, sorry, didn't bring my cheat sheet. On May 13th from 8 till noon, it's a Saturday, we will be having a plant sale in the parking lot. If you know anybody who is going to be dividing plants and would like to share some that we could use to make funds for our building, we would love to have your support. And if you plan on buying plants to support us, that would be great as well. And then the following week on a Friday night, the 19th of May, we're gonna be having a trivia night fundraiser. I call it the Got History Trivia Night because it will be trivia focused on Maine and Winthrop history. A lot of people are concerned, what if I don't know enough about Winthrop? Don't worry, we'll drop some clues in Facebook here and there, but it will be heavier towards the main trivia. We will also be having a silent auction that evening. So if you or anyone you know has items that they'd like to donate for that, we will happily accept that. And included in your fee to participate in the trivia night will be a pizza dinner. So if you have any questions about that, just reach out to me. Thank you so much for coming and supporting.
And if anyone would like to see Mr. Pullen's nephew's picture, I'm sure
Also Stephen Pullen.
also. I'm sure you'd love to show that off. Sure.
All retired?
Yes.
Good.